James River Valley, Dakota Territory, August 1873. The sun was a hammer on an anvil of baked earth. The prairie grass was cured to the color of old brass, and the great empty sky offered no promise of relief. In this vastness, any human endeavor seemed small, temporary. But the work of Cormac Tierney seemed something else entirely, pure madness. His log cabin was finished, a respectable structure of cottonwood, chinked tight with mud and grass. It was a good cabin, solid, no different from the half-dozen others that constituted the settlement. But Cormac was not done. He was now building a second wall around the first, a thick, brutish shell of sod bricks, leaving no gap between the new earth and the existing timber. He worked with a strange, methodical rhythm, using a sharpened spade to cut long ribbons of prairie turf, the dense root mat holding the black soil together. He sliced these ribbons into heavy, uniform blocks, 2 feet long and a foot wide, and began to lay them like massive, earthen masonry. Doss Whitfield, the freight operator, pulled his team to a halt, the dust settling around the wagon wheels. He was a practical man whose world was measured in miles, pounds, and dollars. He looked at Cormac's labor, then at the finished cabin shimmering in the heat, and shook his head. "Tierney," he called out, his voice raspy with dust. "What in God's name are you doing? Building a tomb for yourself before winter even gets here?" A few other settlers, Silas Croft and Jebediah Stone, had gathered, drawn by the strange sight. "Heard of a soddy, of course," Stone muttered, chewing on a piece of grass. "But a soddy wrapped around a log house? That's a new kind of foolish." Cormac paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty hand. He looked at the men, his eyes a pale, startling blue in his sun-browned face. "The wind," he said, his voice carrying the soft lilt of his native Ireland. That was all. He lifted another 100-pound block of earth and set it into place, tamping it down with the flat of his spade. Whitfield dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the disturbed soil. He was not a cruel man, and his concern was genuine, rooted in the hard-won experience of the plains. "Listen to me, man," he said, stepping closer. "I've hauled freight from Omaha to the Red River. I've seen what this country does to wood. You stack that damp earth against your logs, and you're just building a house for rot. That sod traps moisture. It'll sweat all winter and turn your cabin to black mulch. In 2 years, you'll be able to push a finger right through those logs. You're destroying a perfectly good home." Cormac placed another brick, his movements economical and sure. He didn't look at Whitfield. "The peat is wet too," he said, almost to himself, "but it keeps the fire." The men exchanged glances. The Irishman was crazy. He was building a wall of mud around a perfectly good wooden cabin, inviting rot and ruin for a reason no one could understand. The mockery was quiet but certain. The shared consensus of sensible men witnessing an act of profound folly. What did this Irish peat cutter, a man from a damp island of bogs and soft rains, understand about the killing physics of a Dakota winter that these seasoned, practical frontiersmen had so tragically missed? The story of that understanding doesn't begin with building, but with failure. It begins with the brutal education of the previous winter, and a simple, terrifying physics problem that had nearly claimed Cormac's family. If you've ever felt a cold draft in your home and wondered just how much energy you're losing, then stick around. I promise you will learn the devastating power of something called convective infiltration, and how a man with nothing but a spade and a memory of home engineered a solution a century ahead of its time. Tell us in the comments, what's the strangest yet most effective home remedy you've ever seen for dealing with the cold? We dig deep into stories of forgotten genius here. If you appreciate these histories of ingenuity, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It tells us we're on the right track. Cormac Tierney was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, not in the way the men of the Dakotas were, with their steel plows and their faith in the vast, unforgiving soil. He was a man from County Mayo, a place where the land was not so much tilled as it was harvested, layer by layer. He was a peat cutter. His hands understood the heft of a slayan, the specialized spade used to slice the dense, ancient bog. He knew the difference between the top scraw, the fibrous, root-choked layer, and the dark, heavy stone turf below. His entire life had been a negotiation with compressed, damp earth, stacking it to dry, stacking it to burn, stacking it to build low walls that could blunt the relentless Atlantic wind. He had come to America with his wife, Moira, and their two small children, Liam and Siobhan, drawn by the promise of land you could own, not just lease from a distant lord. The Homestead Act was a miracle on paper, but the paper didn't mention the wind. Their first winter in the James River Valley, in that new log cabin, was a nightmare. The cold was a physical presence, an intruder that could not be barred. The logs themselves were thick, honest insulators. The problem was the gaps. Every crack, every seam, every imperfect joint in the chinking was a breach. Cormac had chinked it himself, mixing mud and grass just as he'd been told. But the Dakota wind was not like the Irish wind. It was a dry, surgical cold that didn't just blow, it pushed. It was a constant, high-pressure assault. The chinking, which had dried and shrunk, didn't just leak, it failed. One night in January, a piece blew out with a sharp crack, and a jet of super-chilled air shot into the room like a spear. The details of that winter were seared into his memory. He remembered the flame of their single lantern bending sideways, guttering and dancing as if in a gale, though all the doors and windows were shut. He remembered waking to find the water kettle, sitting just a few feet from the glowing stove, with a skin of ice across its surface. The stove radiated heat, but the wind stole it before it could warm the room. Heat was being pulled out of the house faster than the fire could produce it. They had burned through a winter's supply of wood in 2 months and were forced to start burning precious fence posts. Moira and the children had spent most of January and February in their coats, huddled under every blanket they owned, their faces pinched and blue. Siobhan developed a cough that rattled in her small chest for weeks. Cormac had looked at his family, shivering in the dim, drafty light of his new American home, and felt a cold deeper than the wind. He had failed them. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was failing all around him. His neighbors suffered the same fate, only they accepted it as the price of admission. Their solution was simple: bigger fires. Doss Whitfield hauled in cords of wood at exorbitant prices, and men like Silas Croft burned through them with a kind of desperate fury. They saw the problem as a lack of heat. Cormac, watching the smoke from his chimney get whipped away horizontally the moment it left the flue, began to suspect the problem wasn't the fire at all. The problem was the wind. The problem was pressure. A standard log cabin on the prairie was a study in thermal failure, and the primary culprit was convective infiltration. It's a term that sounds complex, but the reality is brutally simple. Wind hitting the side of a house creates a zone of high atmospheric pressure. It physically forces air through any available opening. On the opposite side of the house, the leeward side, the moving air creates a vacuum effect, a zone of low pressure that actively sucks air out of the house. The result is a constant, invisible river of air flowing through the home. Every BTU of heat generated by the stove is essentially attached to a molecule of air. As the cold air pushes in, it displaces the warm air, which is then pulled out the other side. The fire in the stove wasn't just heating the cabin, it was attempting to heat the entire Dakota Territory. It was a battle that could never be won. The settlers tried to fight it by adding more fuel, more logs on the fire, But that was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom by pouring water in faster. The only real solution was to plug the hole. Cormac's neighbors did their best. They re-chinked constantly. They stuffed rags into cracks. They banked snow against the foundation. But these were temporary fixes, bandages on a mortal wound. The sheer, relentless force of the wind, traveling hundreds of miles across an uninterrupted fetch of flatland, would always find a way in. It would work its way through the tiniest cracks, around window frames, under door sills. The pressure differential was as constant and powerful as gravity. That spring, as the prairie thawed and the ghosts of winter receded, Cormac Tierney did not busy himself with planting a larger crop. He walked his land, spade in hand, and looked not at the soil for its fertility, but for its structure. He saw the thick, tangled mat of buffalo grass roots, a web of organic fiber that had held this soil together for 1,000 years. It was denser than the peat of his homeland. It was heavy. It was stable. And he realized he didn't need to fight the wind. He needed to build a calm. The construction of the sod shell took him the better part of August and September. It was back-breaking labor, performed under the curious and increasingly mocking eyes of his neighbors. He cut the sod bricks with a practiced efficiency that no one else understood. He knew to cut when the soil held just enough moisture to be plastic but not muddy. He knew how to angle the spade to get a clean, square edge. He was not a builder of houses. He was a sculptor of earth. He laid the first course directly against the cottonwood logs of his cabin, starting from the foundation and working his way up. Each block was 2 feet long, a foot wide, and about 6 inches thick, weighing close to 100 pounds. He staggered the joints just like a bricklayer, ensuring there were no continuous vertical seams. He didn't use mortar. The immense weight of the blocks and the slight moisture in the soil would fuse them together into a monolithic structure. Doss Whitfield made a point to stop by every few days on his route, offering the same well-intentioned, professionally grounded advice. "Tierney, it's not too late to pull this foolishness down," he'd say, gesturing at the rising green and black wall. "You're creating a space for mice and snakes, and I'm telling you, the damp will destroy you. I've seen freight boxes, good oak, rot out in a single season when they get packed wrong and can't breathe." Cormac would only nod and grunt, his focus entirely on the fit of the next block. "Needs to be tight," was all he would offer. His wife Moira was more practical in her concerns. "Cormac, it looks like we're living inside a hill," she said one evening, hands on her hips as she surveyed the half-finished walls that now blocked all the lower windows. "And how are we to see out?" Cormac had planned for this. He built deep, angled embrasures for the windows, splaying the sod cuts outward to allow a narrow cone of light to enter. The effect was startling. From the inside, it felt as if they were living in a fortress, the world viewed through thick, earthen tunnels. The house grew darker, quieter. The sounds of the prairie became muffled, distant. By the time he reached the roofline, he had hauled and placed nearly 40 tons of earth. The cabin was no longer a log structure. It was a low, grass-covered mound. Its log origins completely obscured. It looked ancient, primal, something that had grown out of the prairie rather than been built upon it. To the settlers, it was Tierney's folly, a monument to one man's stubborn madness. To Cormac, it was a hypothesis waiting for a test. The science behind his folly was both simple and profound. The thick, 2-foot wall of sod was not primarily for insulation, though it did have some R value. Its true purpose was to serve as an air barrier. It was an impermeable shield against the kinetic force of the wind. Let's put it in numbers. A 40-mile-per-hour wind exerts a pressure of about 5 pounds per square foot on a vertical surface. On a cabin wall 10 feet high and 20 feet long, That's a total force of 1,000 pounds trying to push its way inside. This pressure difference is what drives infiltration. Even a well-chinked cabin might have the equivalent of a 1 square foot hole when you add up all the tiny cracks and seams. Through a hole that size, a 40-mile-per-hour wind can force over 13,000 cubic feet of minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit air into the cabin every hour. To heat that much frigid air up to a livable 60 degrees Fahrenheit requires burning over 20 pounds of good, dry oak every hour just to break even. Cormac's sod shell fundamentally changed the equation. The wind now struck the sod wall, not the log wall. The pressure was exerted on the outer surface of a nearly airtight mass of earth. The air between the sod and the logs, in the tiny remaining imperfections of the fit, became a pocket of still, calm air. The pressure on the log walls dropped to near zero. The mighty, invisible river of wind that flowed through his neighbors' homes was diverted. It flowed around his house, not through it. The pressure differential across the log walls, the engine of heat loss, was eliminated. He hadn't just added insulation, he had turned off the wind. He had built a zone of absolute calm. The test came in the first week of December. A gray sky pressed down, and the temperature plummeted. Then the wind began to rise. It was a ground blizzard, the most feared of all prairie storms. It didn't bring much new snow. It just picked up the existing snow and hurled it sideways with the force of a hurricane. For 16 days, the world outside disappeared into a churning, horizontal chaos of white. The wind howled at a steady 40 miles per hour, with gusts hitting 60. The official temperature, recorded at the distant army fort, hovered at 30 degrees below zero. The wind chill was a lethal minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a storm that killed livestock where they stood and erased roads and landmarks. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a 16-day siege. The wind screamed through their walls. Fine, sharp snow, like sand, was driven through microscopic cracks, forming pale drifts on their floors and windowsills. They huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, but the cold was winning. The Croft family, 2 miles downriver, ran out of firewood on the 10th day. They started burning their chairs, their table, the floorboards from their loft. They survived, but just barely. Inside the Tierney cabin, something miraculous was happening. Nothing. The banshee howl of the wind was a distant, muted roar. The fine, driven snow did not penetrate the sod. There were no drafts. Not a single one. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, Cormac lit a candle, and as Moira and the children watched, he placed it on the deep sill of the west-facing window, the side taking the full brunt of the storm. The flame did not flicker. It did not dance or bend. It burned plumb straight, a tiny, serene spear of yellow light, as if in a dead calm. The house was not just survivable, it was comfortable. The small stove, burning at a lazy, conservative pace, kept the single room at a steady 65 degrees. They were burning less than a quarter of the wood they had consumed during milder cold snaps the year before. The thermal mass of the sod walls, once cooled, held the temperature with incredible stability. Moira could knead bread on the kitchen table, far from the stove, and the dough would rise. Liam and Siobhan could play on the floor in their shirt sleeves. They were not besieged. They were simply home. The terrible killing power of the Dakota winter was raging a few feet away, but it could not touch them. It was locked out. The wind never stopped, but inside Tierney's Folly, it had ceased to exist. Doss Whitfield was trapped at the settlement, his freight operation paralyzed. The storm was a financial disaster, but it soon became a logistical one. He had 10 horses in his makeshift stable, and despite the walls and roof, the building was horribly drafty. The fine snow was getting in, coating their backs, and the constant bitter wind was sapping their strength. They shivered constantly, burning through energy just to stay alive. On the 12th day of the blizzard, his best lead horse, a big roan, strained a tendon in the cramped, icy conditions. It was a valuable animal, and leaving it in the brutal draft of the main stable seemed a death sentence. Desperate, Whitfield remembered the Irishman's strange, earthen mound. The leeward side of that structure, he reasoned, must at least offer a decent windbreak. It was better than nothing. Bundled so heavily only his eyes were visible, he led the lame horse through the blinding, stinging snow. The journey of 200 yards was an epic struggle against a force that wanted to tear the breath from his lungs. He reached the eastern side of Cormac's cabin. The effect was immediate and shocking. The instant he moved into the lee of the massive sod wall, the wind dropped, not by half, but to nearly zero. The air was suddenly, unnervingly still. He could hear his own ragged breathing. He tethered the horse, giving it a small pile of hay, and left it there, pressed against the strange, grass-covered wall. It was a desperate gamble. He returned 3 hours later, expecting to find the animal half frozen. What he found changed his understanding of the world. The horse was not shivering. Its coat was dry. The hay was not scattered by the wind. Around the animal's hooves, the radiant heat from its own body had melted small patches in the snow. The air in this small pocket of calm was noticeably less brutal than the open blizzard. Whitfield stared, confused. A simple windbreak shouldn't work this well. He pulled off his thick mitten and placed his bare hand on the sod wall. He expected to feel the biting, stone-like cold of frozen earth. But it wasn't like that. It wasn't warm, but it was not the life-leeching cold of a log wall in this temperature. It felt inert, dead, a neutral barrier. It had no frost on its surface. He pressed his ear to it and could hear a faint, muffled murmur from inside. He stood back and looked at the roofline. The smoke from the chimney rose in a nearly vertical plume for a good 10 feet before being sheared away by the gale raging above. In that moment, standing in the lee of the sod shell with a calm horse in a hurricane of ice, Doss Whitfield, the practical man of numbers and freight, understood. Cormac Tierney hadn't built a wall to block the wind. He had built a structure to destroy the pressure. He had created an island of stillness in the middle of a tempest. He thought of his own horses, shivering in a stable that was trying to fight the cold with wood, and this one horse calm and dry, protected by earth. He didn't knock on the door. He just led the horse back to the stable, a profound and unsettling respect dawning in his mind. The Irishman wasn't a fool. He was a genius. When the blizzard finally broke on the 17th day, the landscape was scoured and alien. The settlers emerged, gaunt and exhausted. The stories of hardship were everywhere. But the Tierney family emerged looking rested and well-fed. Doss Whitfield was the first to approach the sod-covered cabin. He walked up to Cormac, who was clearing a path, and simply stood there for a moment. "Tierney," he said, his voice quiet, "I owe you an apology. I thought you were a damn fool." He paused, looking at the massive, life-saving walls. "You didn't build a wall," he finally managed, searching for the right words. "You built a calm." Cormac just nodded, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. "The wind is strong," he said, "so the wall must be quiet." That spring, Doss Whitfield's freight wagons carried more than just supplies. They carried a story. At every station, every homestead, every settlement on his route from the James River to Fort Abercrombie, he told the tale of Tierney's jacket. He described the straight-burning candle, the calm horse, the quiet warmth inside the earthen shell during the worst storm in living memory. He, the respected professional who had first and most loudly declared it a folly, was now its most fervent evangelist. He explained the principle as best he could. It's not about the warmth of the sod, he'd tell skeptical farmers. It's about the stillness. The man built an overcoat for his house. The idea, now certified by the harshest possible test and promoted by a credible source, began to spread. That summer, you could see farmers and settlers not building new soddies, but retrofitting their existing log and frame houses. They began cutting the prairie turf and laying it against their walls, creating their own Tierney jackets. The technique was simple, the materials were free, and the proof was undeniable. By the following winter, more than a dozen families in the valley had encased their homes in a thick layer of earth. The fuel savings were astronomical, often as high as 70 or 80%. More importantly, the cabins were transformed from drafty survival shelters into comfortable, livable homes. The idea spread by word of mouth, a piece of folk engineering passed from one neighbor to another, a quiet revolution of earth and grass. What Cormac Tierney did with a spade and a memory of peat bogs was to stumble upon a core principle of modern building science, a full century before it would be given a name. He had created a primitive but exceptionally effective pressure-equalized rain screen system. Modern high-performance buildings are obsessed with the concept of the building envelope, a continuous air barrier that prevents infiltration. Architects and engineers use sophisticated membranes, tapes, and sealants to achieve what Cormac achieved with 40 tons of dirt. His sod shell served as the air barrier, stopping the wind pressure, while the log cabin within served as the insulated, conditioned space. It was a design of profound elegance, born not of theory, but of desperate lived experience. The story of Cormac Tierney's sod shell is more than a tale of frontier ingenuity. It is a lesson in the nature of problems. His neighbors saw the cold as an enemy to be fought with a bigger fire. They saw the symptom. Cormac saw the system. He understood that the cold was just a passenger. The wind was the engine. He didn't try to overpower the engine. He simply decoupled it from the system. He chose to make it irrelevant. The great incessant Dakota wind never changed. It howls across the James River Valley to this day, a constant, elemental force of nature. But for a small group of settlers who learned from a quiet Irishman, it was no longer the defining threat of their existence. They had learned to step aside, to build a pocket of calm, and to let the storm rage on without them. The wind never stopped. It just stopped mattering. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet genius. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten innovators. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other examples of brilliant low-tech solutions to extreme problems have you heard of? Your engagement helps us bring more of these incredible histories to light. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. While the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices, the specific characters, names, and events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. The application of any building techniques, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.